Hi guys, I'm John Edward Willie, and this is sort of an improvised, open-ended, jazz-like tribute to the question, what is the truth? Before we can ask the question, we have to see that we're not asking the question, what do I think is true? In other words, I'm not talking about what I think is true about the world or true about myself. And also, on the other hand, I'm not asking the question, at least not here, is there such a thing as the truth? Can we even speak about the truth? Instead, we're stepping back, which is what philosophers do. And in stepping back, we're doing something, at least right here, right now, in these videos, something that is almost boring because it's so basic and so fundamental. And in a lot of ways, almost similar to like fitness and other practices like art making. Philosophy really is about the repetition of fundamentals. That is, one is continually reorienting oneself towards the questions, what is knowledge, what is truth, what is justice, what is wisdom? And one of those questions, what is truth, is what I hope to address here. And this is a continuation in a series of videos I've been making about fundamental philosophical subjects. And these are subjects that in many ways one wants to get a grasp of, one wants to have a really solid understanding of before one goes about asking other kinds of questions like, can we even know the truth? Or what would it mean for the truth perhaps to be something that we can't imagine it to be? That is, perhaps it's, as Marxists and post-Marxists say, the truth is ideological. That is, there's an underlying sense that it's protecting a class or a gender order. There are even Freudian approaches or Lacanian approaches or Carl Jungian approaches, which ask the question, what is it that is working like a shadow within us to help us sublimate the truth? And I'm simply saying that to suggest that in order to get to that kind of consideration, we first have to ask ourselves a more basic kind of question. Because as I've said, philosophy is a kind of conceptual engineering. And so what we have to get a grasp of are the concepts within concepts, that is the working logic of philosophical concepts. And so what is the truth, right? Well, there are three important philosophical ideas regarding the truth. And those are the coherency theory of truth, the pragmatic theory of truth, and the correspondence theory of truth. And I think those are the most important to think about because they represent different views in the history of rational thinking. And I put rational in quotes because I don't mean that as it might sound, but it is important to understand it as it exists in the Western tradition. I think in order to critique it, that is to imagine alternatives, but also more fundamentally to explore many of the more exuberant and perhaps open-ended and perhaps helpful ways of thinking that come out of the 20th century and 21st century in regards to the question, what is truth? And before that as well, meaning that Martin Heidegger, in his relation to truth, is extremely powerful and it almost explodes everything. And so once one begins thinking about what Heidegger meant about truth, one begins to experience a kind of augmentation, a kind of change that has to do with the fact that in asking these particular kinds of questions, he opens up particular dimensions of our own being. But before you can get there, as I am reiterating, one must have a working grasp of the fundamentals. And there are other ideas, such as the neo-pragmatic view of truth, i.e. Richard Rorty, the great American philosopher, who built upon what we'll discuss, which is the pragmatic theory of truth, and in many ways turned it on its own head. And exploring what that means, especially relation to another philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein, in many ways sets the scene for where contemporary philosophy is at. And yet, once again, to get to that point, one has to have a sense of what the Western tradition and has meant by truth. And of course, there are other versions of the truth outside of the West. But in order to understand those other points of view, specifically the Chinese, for instance, or specifically the Hindu or ancient Buddhist, one must have a working understanding of one's own sense of truth, in the sense that one emerges out of a tradition that one can't escape, that one is an expression of. And that's something I keep going back to in a lot of my talks, which is that we often fail to see what we think in the first place. Like, we often fail to, we critique others, or we either critique others like in an extreme way, or we just don't pay attention to what we think because we've given up on the question sort of altogether. But I think that betrays the ability we have to ask the question once again, in a way that might return some of its value. And I say that because I'm suggesting that I return to this idea because thinking itself, if you didn't know, is inherently circular. And so good philosophical thinking is still a bit circular, and that circulation is what I'm doing as I work my way into positing a truth. And so even in the way that I speak, I'm sort of hinting at a way of conceiving of truth that's outside of what we often think of as truth, as being a proposition, as being an analytical concept relating particularities in the mind to particularities in the world. But let me step back. The most common kind of belief about truth that people have without knowing that they have is coherency. And so they accept or dismiss another person's belief largely based on whether it coheres with what they already take to be the case. And so coherency theory means that a person judges the truth or falsehood of something based on whether or not it coheres with what they already take to be true. And so in almost no matter where you come from in the world, you find that this is almost built into human beings. Like, this explains a particular kind of narrowness, because when one understands it even in an evolutionary way, or even in a self-serving or a kind of defensive way, one sees that this way of protecting one's beliefs, all the while ensuring that it isn't destabilized, means that one is almost prone to believe something as to whether or not it fits in or mirrors the stories that we're already telling ourselves about what the world is. And so coherency theory is the most common kind of belief about truth, because it is culture itself. Culture is about a particular kind of stability and coherency, which resists what is always antithetical to culture, which we call the otherness, with a capital O. Otherness is that which is often outside of the linguistic or semiotic or power-based functions of a culture. And in many ways, the cultures that actually thrive and grow are those that aren't merely coherent, because they're not so rigid as to not expand and be flexible over time. So one has to ask themselves, what quality of truth besides coherency would one have to admit in order for your society or culture to be able to flexibly respond to sudden outside changes, or sudden inside changes? Because change is always the nature of the game. And all the while, coherency protects your ability to stay sane in many ways and to sustain a cartoon-like sort of fantasy about the world, it ultimately must adapt to the world itself. And so the second idea about what truth is sort of comes from that. And in many ways, as Americans, we are sort of born with this view. And so we believe that something is true based on whether or not it makes us happy, or we based it on whether or not something functions or works. So if it works, it must be true. There must be something true about it. And so we tend to trust in what is called instrumental value, that which rewards itself in believing in. I remember in Tony Robbins, Anthony Robbins, Tony Robbins, the personal power guy, in his first book, Unlimited Power, I believe there's a chapter called "It Doesn't Matter If It's True." And basically the chapter, I believe, is about how beliefs only function to serve us. And so it doesn't matter whether or not you're deluded, because this very delusion is at the heart of a lot of American entrepreneurship and innovation. This kind of belief that something is true is often what makes it true, right? It's amazing how, as it said, when one believes that something is true, it sort of becomes true. And in many ways, that's what is called pragmatism. And whereas coherency has a sort of ambiguous history, and pragmatism has a sort of commonsensical tradition, at least in relatively healthy functioning societies, you can see that it is a reflection of who we are. And what both of these elements lack, however, is the fundamental infusion of the eternally delightful and rewarding concept that things are not true based on whether they cohere with your pre-held beliefs or the narratives or the operating system that you're using to make sense of the world. And things are not true because it makes you happy, and it's not true just because it works for you. Something is true based on whether or not it adheres to the world itself. This is what we call objectivity. This is what's called the correspondence theory of truth. So a statement is true whether or not it reflects the world. And understanding this as being something that has to be understood before it can be questioned, I think is sort of fundamental in the philosophical process, because, as I said, most people are struggling with figuring out what they already believe. I think that when we are suddenly, at least Americans, when we have the spotlight put on us and we're asked what we think, we so rarely have to answer that question that we don't know how to answer it. And so much of this discussion regarding what coherency is and what correspondence is and what pragmatism is, the point is to get a person to see that in many ways, much of what you are is a manifestation of all three of these. And that manifestation of these three qualities is sort of a configuration of the entire Western tradition, because there are things that sort of separate the Western tradition in the way that all traditions, like the Hindu, as I mentioned earlier, or the Chinese, they are singular in their own way. And that singularity cannot be compared. I don't think it's comparative to what within the Western tradition, which in many ways is a combination of the Hebraic and the Athenian. I think that you find that this tendency towards believing in a sort of mitigation of standards, that is modality. We shifted modalities based on whether it adheres to what we believe, whether it works for us, and whether it's true. I mean, in many ways, many of us operate without a narrative. And so we're sort of almost like a free-floating consciousness testing the world. But of course, this horrifies people who really believe that there ought to be a systematic way of thinking about what truth is. And because there certainly is a display of it in the analytical mathematical sciences, especially in the degree to which they work. And much of reality, when we pursue it, whether astronomically or microscopically, it often adheres to these astonishingly meticulous, spectacular complexities that are just like dazzling and musical in themselves. And so one is almost like torn asunder. One is almost, one almost experiences death by astonishment, as it's said. So these three ideas, I think, can be separated and parsed out. Like, you could slow down and think about what coherency means. And one could see that it is a rational move. And when you begin with Plato, he begins to judge the world in regards to its adherence to, or its coherence to, ideas. And so Plato initiates so much of this, especially with the optimism that he exudes about the possibilities of knowledge. Nobody's more optimistic than Plato, right? And so we begin on Plato's mountain, and we begin with this idea that is strange and alien to us. It is so alien to us, and yet it's also at the very heart of who we are. And that's the idea that truth is an idea, and that reality itself is secondary to our ideas. And there is a sort of mythical, poetic connection to Aeschylus and Hesiod and much of what was going on in the primordial Greek mind. And Heidegger makes much of that in his discussion of Parmenides. But I think that returning to these fundamentals, like the question, what is pragmatism? And what is correspondence, and really thinking about them is where the real richness is found. Because it's really easy to want to go on from here, right? But I think one thing that is key to who I am philosophically is that I actually slow down. Like, instead of trying to get out of this wilderness of coherency and confusion, I sort of make myself at home in that, because I find that as human beings, we never really leave these philosophical dimensions. And our lives, in many ways, on a daily basis, are testing these dimensions. And when we think of ourselves as having ended the conversation, in other words, many people are so self-satisfied that they just assume that the correspondence theory is the final conversation, is the end of the conversation. In other words, a lot of people that are influenced by naturalism and what you might call secular thinking often believe that there's no point in philosophical thinking, and there's no point in speculation, there's no point in daydreaming, there's no really any point in anything, because to them, all of the truth is to be found in what they think of as science. And in many ways, this isn't science. This is what is called scientism. So to say that it is scientistic is to say that it is not the same thing as what science is doing, because science itself is an inherently open project. Science itself is an inherently open project. And that's how it is easily misunderstood by philosophers and everyone else. But scientism is the most common tendency in those, scientific or not, to reduce the world to its most basic phenomenon. That is to say that what counts as truth is crystallized by the mind's ability to adhere to the propositional nature of the world. Because the assumption is that the world itself can be explained through this kind of mental activity, which can only, in many ways, understand things as it happens late at night when there's a flash of lightning, and for a few seconds you can sort of look around. Even that would be too much for them, because as a poetical person, this tendency to them almost reeks of religion. So in many ways, people who believe deeply in the correspondence theory, and what I mean to say is those who reject pragmatism and those who reject its descendants like neo-pragmatism, and also those who reject the coherency theory outright, because they see it as connected to theology, they see it as connected to mysticism. And I think there's a very legitimate basis for the over-exaltation about what counts as truth as being something that can be reduced to scientific understanding, like the world is just a bunch of chemicals, we are just animals. And I'm emphasizing the word just, that the universe is just a bunch of rocks, that we are just basically a cancerous creature on a rock floating around in a sort of antique department of the universe, and again, I'm being poetical about what in many people's minds is the truth itself. And I think that this kind of idea is not incorrect, because they're building their ideas based on the 17th and 18th century scientific revolutions, which gave us the world that we should have a great gratitude for having. It's a world of unbelievable it's a world in which the standards of living have risen unbelievably. And so again, in the same way that one has to understand the fundamental concepts of philosophy, one has to have a kind of fundamental gratitude. I hate that word gratitude, but one has to have a fundamental sort of admiration for the degree to which the correspondence theory of truth through the scientific and industrial revolutions also gave us the liberal, democratic, republican revolutions. So you can't have within our world the kind of managerial, liberal, democratic, republican political system without the correspondency theory. We simply take for granted the fact that Europe and then America took over the world and in many ways imposed a system on the world, so that you're almost not successful unless you don't adhere to what could philosophically be called a kind of Cartesian view of the world, which is in many ways a positive explosion of a healthy idea about what counts as truth, but in many ways, like everything else, becomes something that is tragic and horrifying over time. So it's true that European colonialism and the expansion of American empire itself is driven by a kind of correspondence, a theory of truth. That in itself is still a reductive way of thinking about what truth is, because it's still the same thing as the scientific, except that it's really the politicic. I just invented a word, a new neologism, the politicic, which is the way in which we want to reduce the complexity of our experience to these otherwise reified concepts, and to take correspondence as being something other than what it is to fall into this trap. I'm so glad I'm recording myself, because I hope that in listening to this, I can make some kind of sense of it. I sort of feel like the drunk people that I used to deal with in bars I worked in, who sort of like made all the sense in the world to themselves, but didn't make any sense to anybody else. That's like the drunk person, like sort of lives in a world of coherency, right? Like something is true only if it coheres to their dream, to their reflection. But also there's, ways that this reflects each of us in our own desires, because even if you're sober or whatever, like your consciousness is still shaped by desire, and your desires in many ways are still shaped by your culture. So we are taught how we are in the world in many ways more than we realize. And even desire itself is taught. It doesn't take a Lacanian to see that. And so we often tend not to think about true, but to focus on anything at all in relation to our own desire. So the very concept of desire as shaping the preconditions of truth, that in itself is a threat to the more reductive ways of thinking about truth as being a kind of correspondence, because suddenly truth has a kind of erotic quality. Truth is sort of shaped by a kind of erotic nature that tends to notice beautiful women, for instance, more than anything else, or tends to notice the meaningful or the poetical. That in itself is shaped by perhaps the erotic zone that can exist outside of a person in regards to the location of their attention. And I say these sort of as speculative displays of possible ways of thinking about what truth is that return a person to the more general classical question of what is truth, because that is super rewarding and valuable to ask these questions that really can't be answered, because of course that's looming in the back of anyone's mind who's listening, right? It's looming in the back of anyone's mind. Like they're thinking there is no truth, or that it's all subjective, or that it's all relative. But that in itself is a sort of cynical reflection of an underlying catastrophic betrayal. And so as a child of the 90s, I totally get it. But it's also to miss something that people who are sort of objectivist or rationalists, if they're clear thinking, they're right to restate, which is that a really clear view of objectivity, or a really clear, healthy view of correspondence theory, is really a way of saying that we are honoring the world itself, and that what counts as true is reality. And so something is true if the world is the case, and even the possibility of it being the case. This is a way of pulling a person out of potential delusion or potential self-delusion, because the fundamental limitation with coherency is that it's perfectly logical for your beliefs to be perfectly logical. And you see this all the time. It's perfectly sensible to have a coherent view of the world, but it's also perfectly possible to be incorrect in every way. It's perfectly the case. It's perfectly possible that a person might be wrong about almost everything, even if they have a kind of intuitive understanding of the world that allows them to sort of compartmentalize that and move forward. And so when one sees that coherency theory can be critiqued in many ways and teased apart, one can then perhaps begin to see that it's not over, because, as I mentioned, the erotic shapes our attention in regards to what counts as truth, as simply one example of where attention can be. Not that all attention is sexualized. It's not that sort of overly Freudian idea, but the idea that even in choosing what counts as like a scientific subject, a person is sort of enacting what is called a hermeneutic sort of existence, which is that existence is interpretive. So this is reflection of the pragmatic and the neo-pragmatic traditions that come out of Richard Rorty, but they don't have to be reduced to that. It's not that one has to think simply about Richard Rorty as being something that one has to study, because I don't want to push anybody away from philosophy by making them think they have to read these in almost impossible to read sort of text. And I mean to suggest that when I bring up the hermeneutic sort of relation that we have to reality, what I mean to displace is what I'm also hoping that is super clear to people about objective reality and objective truth and what counts as truth. Because what counts as truth has to have something to do with the world itself. This is not very popular right now, and yet I think if you are sincere and pay attention to reality, no matter your critique, it will otherwise become absolutely obvious to you that such a thing as truth does exist. And it's almost the case that if it isn't obvious to you, then you're not even alive. And of course, I'm quoting a character from a lesser known film called Weatherby from the 80s. And it's about a graduate student who kills himself and whose suicide haunts a group of academics and intellectuals. And within this movie, there's a scene where this person, this graduate, is able to catch the whole group of academics off guard by reminding them that questions about elemental definitions cannot be explained, because if they have to be explained, you're not alive. And of course, I'm potentially misquoting this brilliant character in a film, but I think that there's something to be said for the very commonsensical kind of relation that a lot of people have to the truth, you know, in the way that it's so obvious that it can't be questioned, you know. And when you begin with the correspondence theory of truth, you can see that there's something to be said for what is also called the redundancy theory about truth, which is simple, that the question of what is true, or the proposition that something is true, is irrelevant, because simply by saying something, you're saying that it's true. In other words, there's an inherent quality that announces itself in our truth saying. So there's a quality that announces itself in our truth saying. And as formalized in the redundancy theory, we're left with the startling realization that perhaps the entirety of the Western project regarding the theoretical question of what is truth itself is misplaced by this inability to see what is perceptually grounded, immediate, and automatic. Meaning that if you have to ask yourself, what is the definition of death? What is the definition of lust? What is the definition of desire? What is the meaning of rage, anger, revenge? These things are locked in to us. And that isn't merely a way of ignoring the question itself or trying to say that the question of truth itself is completely mistaken, but it's a way of, I think, seeing that it is true that Western tradition is in many ways off kilter in thinking about truth as being one of these three things, especially when you see not only that desire can shape things and that there is something fundamentally hermeneutic about our interpretive relation to the world, that in choosing one thing, we're ignoring everything else. But we begin to see that the very question of truth opens up the very question of what we can question. And so for Nietzsche and Wittgenstein and Heidegger, this is a impossible juncture. This is where the modernist tradition and Descartes and David Hume reaches its apotheosis. It reaches its apotheosis in Heidegger and Wittgenstein, but also in figures like Karl Popper, for instance, or even Deleuze, Deleuze, and others. You see that the question itself is reanimated by the very existential concerns and catastrophic reverberations and the sort of consumerist revolutions, and then the technological revolutions of the 20th century. All of these introduced new dimensions into what were otherwise fundamental Western questions. And this in many ways mirrors what jazz and blues and other forms of music were in the 20th century in regards to the Western musical tradition. Philosophy took these ideas and these concepts and, I think, in many ways did the unsayable, to borrow one of Wittgenstein's words about what is true and what is not true. Because for Ludwig Wittgenstein, at least the early Wittgenstein, his conception of the correspondence theory of truth had to do with the idea that only what could be defended as a proposition could count as true. In other words, only things that had a relation to the world could count as truth, and that everything else for Wittgenstein was unsayable. And there's sort of like a mystical quality to Wittgenstein, and there's a conversation around that mysticism. But there's a group who dismissed the mysticism in Wittgenstein, or dismissed the concept of silence, and really held on to the idea that what counts as true is only that which in our language or minds can correspond to reality. And those were called the logical positivist. And the logical positivist still exists today in regards to the continual desire for a kind of belief system that can have certainty because it is justified by mathematical and scientific truths. And yet, I brought up Karl Popper because Karl Popper, in many ways, is sort of an explosion of that idea of positivism, of that element that comes out of Wittgenstein. And Wittgenstein himself changed over time. So he can't really be reduced to the ways that the logical positivists and others set themselves up by being so reductive and scientistic, as I said, as to warrant the decimation at the hands of Karl Popper. And his idea of falsification is the key idea in seeing that what actually counts as true from Karl Popper's point of view is that which has not yet been proven to be false. And so it's kind of a strange way of thinking about what is truth, but it's more common in philosophy of science. It's the much more common view in those who are thinking about truth as not merely correspondence, but truth as probability. And that the idea that truth is statistical in many ways represents the modern technological managerial view of the world. The managerial computerized view of the world and of truth, sees it in this way, as something that can be not understood in regards to truth about facts, but truth about propositions that can be measured, mitigated, because in many ways the modern economy and world politics is dealing with a kind of complexity that in itself cannot be grasped. It's assumed by many that the complexity of the world can somehow be understood, but that's just, fundamentally ignorant of the fact that the complexity of the world itself is so exceedingly outmaneuvering all of us at every point that the very best we can set up, the very best kind of worldview that we can have, isn't a worldview at all. It's not a vision of the world, but it's a way of managing the world. It's a way of finding a way of ensuring that out of this all engulfing complexity, that one is not swallowed whole, that one can stabilize their worldview. And I think that view of truth as being representative of the sort of utopian metaverse AI type people, it's very reflective of the kind of view that they have, because it's a view that fits in with the algorithmic. It's an idea the AI utopia metaverse vision of the world fits in with the algorithmic revolutions of the 2010s and 2000s, which began to see the control of information and the selling of information as having something to do with power itself, i.e. money. And so that very idea of truth is almost like strangely parallel to B.F. Skinner, to the kind of quasi-utopian scientific American views that many of us have often had, that I refer to as reductively correspondent. But B.F. Skinner and these AI people are reflections of this. And that's, again, why I think Heidegger, for instance, is a wonderful challenge to the statistical model of the world. And I use the word statistical because I think that complexity theory and complexity science and chaos theory is precisely the kind of starting point, like for trying to think about like what AI would mean, because it would ultimately mean managing a kind of complexity that sort of exceeds us on every level. And it's sort of a way of doing what like police officers and what social activists are doing. Social activists and police officers are really just doing at the same time, which is not creating a vision, not leading in any way, but just simply managing the truth. And that itself is a statistical vision of the truth. So I've said today that I was primarily interested in these first three conceptions of truth as being the basis of thinking about what truth could mean. But when you live in a world that thinks in the way that I've just laid out, which is a statistical, probabilistic view of the world, which in many ways is trying to manage chaos, trying to prevent the very worst from happening. That's the kind of view of the world and economy of the world that both Bush and Obama had created together, and was sort of labeled neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is sort of just a really bad word for this kind of complexity, for this kind of complexity being managed. And so what is always a threat to this management is the kind of catastrophes that it creates. Neoliberalism has been unable to wrestle with these catastrophes that have then given birth in Russia and America to a kind of populism and nationalism. Because populism and nationalism in its various forms is often trying to protect and resurrect a kind of narrative that in itself is out of touch with reality, but is sort of seen as a golden age that we can return to, because there's precisely like a lack of options, a lack of alternatives, because nobody in their right mind can really wrestle with this kind of like sort of complexity. Nobody can really like make sense of this kind of disorder. And I think it's more appropriate to open oneself up to the singularity of the complexity itself, which is our experience, because underneath all of the complexity, there actually is an order. And it's not just merely the biological, but it's the order of reality itself having almost nothing to do with these considerations. And so it's no wonder that I brought up the redundancy theory of truth as being sort of a reflection of the better parts of the correspondency theory, which sees that it's almost inane to say that something is true, because in saying it, obviously you assume that it's true. But I think it's another thing to see that, and this is what I missed out earlier, I sort of lost my thought, I lost my train of thought, because what I was wanting to develop is a positive sense of how coherency theory makes a comeback. Because coherency theory fits in with the hermeneutic theory of reality, which is that we don't see reality because we are seeing what we want to see. And so what we call truth is what we already take to be the case. And so there's almost something like inescapable about that idea, because one can never see reality. Instead, one only sees what one's culture wants one to see. One is sort of locked into that kind of view of reality, and one sort of like can't escape the language and the very logic and the very terms that one is using. One is sort of like born into it. And to even think that one could have a thought that corresponds to reality is to miss the fact that there are structures that are determining who you are and what counts as truth and what counts as reality. And I think that something has to be said about this in regards to other kinds of ideas about truth that are counter to the coherency theory or the pragmatic theory or even the correspondence theory. And the best way to think about that is to see that it's not just that with Aristotle, the concept of truth was flipped on its head, because Aristotle is in many ways an inversion of Plato. And so what counts as true in the better parts of Aristotle is what corresponds to reality. And what you find occurring, though, is an increasing lowering of the standards of what counts as truth over time. And so it's odd to say that Isaac Newton represents a step down in terms of what standards we had regarding what counts as truth. But when you look at the very heights of Neoplatonism in the Renaissance, in the 15th and 16th century, and their overly exuberant sense of what counts as truth reaches its apotheosis in Isaac Newton, given that Isaac Newton was seen as true and correct, but also scarily hermetic, meaning hermetic, meaning that Isaac Newton's concept of gravity has a lot in common with alchemical traditions. It's well known that Isaac Newton was a kind of alchemist, but even his idea of gravity in the most scientific sense was a severe step down from the overly exultant concepts of what kind of certainty about reality we could have, as I mentioned, when we begin with the Neoplatonists of the Renaissance, or even the various figures of the Enlightenment prior to Newton, who had imagined that we would know much more than even what Isaac Newton known. Once we could see that, Isaac Newton, even though it was understood to be correct and science was starting to break through, a lot of people were starting to challenge the very idea that we can know truth, because it began to be increasingly obvious to people throughout thinking parts of the world that your culture was shaping who you were, and that we had a disposition that made us think the way that we thought. And what this meant was that universalism wasn't possible. The idea that everything was relative, that everything was skeptical, wasn't really something new in Western societies, but it made its comeback. And so in making its comeback as a sort of shadow paralleling the European Enlightenment, this kind of radical skepticism, which took the form of people saying things as astonishing as there is no God, we are on a planet that is moving around the sun, as Giordano Bruno said, or as Darwin would say, that we are animals, sort of thinking backwards. We can then see that Immanuel Kant, in relation to both Aristotle and Plato, represents a key turning point. Because prior to Immanuel Kant in the 18th century, truth was understood to be a positive project. So we would simply know things about the world. We would accumulate knowledge, and it didn't have to be positivism in the way that they had imagined all truth to accumulate, but people more or less took it for granted that philosophy and naturalism and truth-telling was ultimately going to reward itself, and that it would build upon itself, almost like a kind of capital, almost like information were a kind of capital. But as that began to fade and ebb with the rise of skepticism, but also the rise of multiculturalism, which began to really see the very differences in society, you begin to see that the conception of positive knowledge was no longer needed with Immanuel Kant, because Immanuel Kant is the birth of negative metaphysics. Prior to Kant, everything was positive. But Kant introduces into philosophy not the idea of what we know per se, but the very structures that precondition our knowledge as such. So it's not the question of whether or not the truth comes from our experience of reality, or does truth come from our rational deductions and thoughts about the propositions we already know to be true. The question is, what must be the case in order for something to be true? What are the a priori elements that must be the case for anything to be the case? And the most simplest way to think about this is to imagine, to do a little thought experiment and imagine what it would be like for there not to be time or space. We often assume that some kind of transcendental, some kind of out-of-body experience is possible, or that one could, at least for a moment, escape space and time. But to imagine that possibility is impossible from Kant's point of view. And I think that he's justified in believing this, because what he's meaning to suggest is that there is a horizon. There's a horizon in human thinking that we can't really think outside of. There's a horizon that the further into it we go, the more we really return back to ourselves. And that condition is space and time, as one way of putting it. And to connect this to the critique, to critical thinking, this is also the birth of critical theory. This is critical theory in its original grounding, which is the critique of pure reason. The critique of pure reason is Immanuel Kant's first big book. And the idea of the critique of pure reason is at the heart of critical theory. You have the word critique and critical. And those are related, but they're not merely terms, because what critical metaphysics is a profound emergence in Western philosophy that has to do with things being true in a way that's very different than how we ever thought of truth. So if you're ever frustrated with super left-wing people, or people who have college degrees who are like using a kind of terminology and phraseology that, if you're a thinking person, almost sounds like Gnosticism, then you may be talking to someone who is the descendant of this Kantian tradition that I myself am a reconstruction of. So I speak freely about this as someone who is innately Kantian. You know, I say that tongue in cheek because I'm not, but I think that Kant himself can be reconstructed in a way that has nothing to do with how he's typically understood as being an idealist, as being this kind of person that he absolutely was not. Because what he was first and foremost was a modest individual who was wanting to both honor the possibilities of our thinking, but also put a limitation to what could not be said. And so it's quite ironic that the very tradition that comes out of him is one that is obsessively obfuscating everything and sort of continually delving into what is, as Wittgenstein would say, unsayable. That's the Kantian grounding of truth as it can be turned into a cartoon. Because there are other ways of thinking about this, you know. For instance, another thought experiment, besides the thought experiment of thinking without space and time, is to imagine simply having the ability to shoot off of planet Earth and to go into outer space and to keep going. Like, imagine you could go forever and just head in one direction. The question is whether or not that direction would end. Because to Kant, there was a problem, which is that it's 100% equally rational to imagine that one could go on forever. But it's also 100% equally rational to imagine that one could not go on forever. So you have two conditions that are equally rationally plausible. And so that's another way of thinking about what Immanuel Kant's critical metaphysics can be. Because it's a way of beginning with the ways that our language and metaphysics break down. Because the question isn't whether something is rationally true. Because things can be rationally true that are contradictory. So the question is then, what can we speak about? What kind of limitation is placed upon us? And yet that is not how Kant was taken. Kant was in fact turned into many other things. And so if you're familiar with philosophy, then you're familiar with Hegel and other kinds of traditions that come out of this. But that's not really important. What's really important if you're a person who reads philosophy books, is understanding Kant himself. And unfortunately, he was like the worst writer of all time. I mean, Kant unfortunately had a terrible, like, scholastic way of explaining himself, and yet we have an urgency in us that demands that we read this, that we read Kant, because he himself is the very embodiment of the complexity of our situation in regards to what is thinkable and not thinkable, and in regards to what it would mean to begin as a brain-based creature who was operating in a world which demanded that one paid a kind of sensitivity to its modalities, to its shifting calls, to how we have to act ethically, and what is rational in ethics is not what is rational in science. And so I mentioned a few complexities earlier, which are reductively called paradoxes, because they're not paradoxes. They're actually more profound than that. They're called aporias, or Kant called them antinomies. But it's a relation to the truth that instead of saying that we have an idea of what is truth, it's a way of saying that we know what is not true, that we have an inherent kind of horizon, as I say, which is our body for Kant. It is being brains. We have a kind of grounding that we are working within and against. And so I think that understanding of Kant and of these concepts opens up a possibility of understanding the other figure that I mentioned, which is Heidegger, because Heidegger is the explosion here. Heidegger is a kind of experience as a philosopher, which in many ways only begins when one already has a kind of grasp of what he's working within and what he's working against. Because anyone who's thinking clearly is really thinking, at least in a dialectic kind of way, thinking with and against Heidegger. Because for him, truth isn't corresponded so much as unconcealment. And so there's traditionally what is called the revelatory theory of truth, which is like the original theory of truth, that the truth reveals itself. And we laugh at that, especially rational people. They laugh at the idea that truth is testimony. Like, truth is testimony is also really common. In other words, you know something because you were told that it was true. And that fits in with the revelatory conception of what truth is, which is that the truth announces itself. Traditionally, revelatory knowledge meant that saints or particular martyrs had experiences and therefore had revelations that are then passed on and held on to in different traditions. And it's one thing to laugh at that. It's one thing to see it as something that we've really overcome as a society, because we tend to think about beliefs and knowledge in a very detached way. But this is where Heidegger takes us back to this kind of thinking in a way that honors its immediacy. Because Heidegger is not Catholic per se, although he does have many obvious relations to the Jesuit tradition. What he actually is attempting to do is to get us to let go of the absurdities and the burdens of epistemology. You know, epistemology is the philosophical theory as to what knowledge is. And that's why so many college-educated people and intellectuals obsessively discuss the question, like, is this table here? Is there such a thing as truth? Can we know the truth? How would we know the truth? And so to Heidegger, he in many ways is a brilliant way of stepping around all of this. Because to Heidegger, he begins not with theory itself, but with the way in which the truth announces itself. And so this does have a relation that a lot of people point out to religious traditions, especially St. Augustine, and as well as other sort of figures who had, like Parmenides for Heidegger, who had a kind of sense that what counts as truth actually has to do with not knowledge itself epistemologically as grasping, but as freedom. That's what's so profound about the early Heidegger in his relation to what truth is, because the answer for him in regards to the question of the concept of what is truth is freedom, because freedom allows for what could be taken as a kind of relaxation, a kind of backing off. Because in order for truth to announce itself, for truth to reveal itself, you have to be able to think through your senses. And if you're lost in your mind, you don't see the way that reality is telling you what to do. And I think a more grounded, commonsensical way of thinking about this is that you don't really have to know what counts as ethical. You don't have to have a theory of ethics. You don't even have to know what is right and wrong. What you have to do is have the courage to do what is right and wrong, because in fact, in experience, it's really that reality announces itself and tells us what to do. And so it's not really a theoretical concern so much as the existential capacity to animate that courage and to allow ourselves to relax into action and to act the truth. And so the truth in itself then is a carnal, physical thing. And in many ways, that's related to the neo-pragmatic view of truth, which is that it has something to do with honoring this ability to allow people and things to announce themselves. And yet, in many ways, this vision of truth itself has sort of fallen barren, fallen empty. It's sort of entering a new phase, so to speak. And I think the way to think about it is to think about the philosopher Graham Harman and also the philosopher Bruno Latour, because Graham Harman and Bruno Latour are reanimations of this Heideggerian physical sense that the problems that we face in regards to truth are not epistemological problems. They're not problems with knowledge. They're not problems that have anything to do with a theory of truth. They're actually problems that have to do more with the perceptual grounding towards allowing ourselves to have the attitude and the disposition for truth to announce itself. In other words, truth is not the quality of a proposition or a set of features in an intellectual construction, but is itself something that makes itself known. And so the question then is whether or not we are courageous enough to be open to it. So that's sort of my improvised jazz-like performative attempt to dance along the contours of these various questions containing the question, what is truth? I'm John Edward Willie. I love you all.